Playbook fans, we are back. I am Sweetheart. I got Shovit. And no, that is not Shishot in a disguise. We have a guest on the episode today. You might recognize his face. If you listen, you'll definitely recognize his voice. This is none other than Dave Kluge, who is all across the fantasy scope in the last 2-3 years, really up and coming. Twitter has gone out the wazoo, and, just kind of stalking you for the last 48 hours, Dave, after you agreed to come on the podcast. Man, you have your hand in so many different places. Again, we talked about it before we started recording, the bandwidth that it takes for you to be able to do the amount of shows, do your own show, put out your articles, tweet as much as you do. It's insanity. And it's something that me and Shovit obviously aspire to be and get to that level of. So thank you so much, obviously, for joining us, Dave. I want to kick it off with you, give you a couple minutes with the floor. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, how this dream kind of became a reality, and how we can follow suit.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. Looking forward to talking some ball today. But I don't know, man, just kind of stumbled into this job by happenstance. I never, wanted to be like a big time podcaster or anything like that. I was actually started my journey on Reddit completely anonymously, right? Back in 2017, 2018, 2019, I was just writing text posts as full articles. And then somebody from Fantasy Pros reached out and they said, hey, we wanted to offer you a job. And, I immediately thought that I was going to be like the lead analyst, this big guy at Fantasy Pros. No. I was covering NBA games for 50 cents per blurb. Like, I'm working 20, 30 hours a week, and I was lucky to make a couple $100 a month doing it. So did that for a few years, kind of got my reps in, and then started podcasting, during quarantine out in 2020. And that's when I kind of got a taste of podcasting, really enjoyed doing it. And it's just kind of snowballed from here. So I'm just riding the wave, enjoying it. But you can find all of my content over at Football Guys. I have been a longtime subscriber of Football Guys. I'm talking mid 2000s is when I signed up there. So getting to work there now, like rubbing elbows every single day with my peers and, these people who I've been idolizing and reading their works since I was in high school. It's just a surreal experience. But you can follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge and find all of my content over at Football Guys.
How did the background with football start, Dave? I know you're a Bears fan. Talk to me a little bit about how, not just the fandom, but the passion, and then specifically maybe just from a fantasy football perspective.
Well, I don't know where you guys live exactly, but being from the Midwest, winters are brutal. I was born and raised in Chicago, and that's pretty much all we have. It's like, you just get this period of like 4 to 5 months where you don't see the sun and it's cold and the snow just piles up. You can't go outside. You can't do anything. So football just kind of becomes your life. I never really had a choice. My dad, my uncles, grandparents, everybody were just huge football fans in my life. So I've got pictures of me like 3 years old inside Soldier Field, all bundled up at Bears games. I never really had a choice, but I can remember being like 7, 8 years old, sitting on the couch, watching my dad in his fantasy football league. And this was before computers.
Wow.
He'd be taking phone calls in the morning where he'd be getting everyone's lineup in over the phone. And then we'd be writing down numbers at halftime and things like that. So I've been watching him play fantasy football his whole life. I got into fantasy football in high school. And as a numbers guy, somebody who had always excelled at math, the combination of a sport that I played in football and then numbers, it just made sense for me. And I loved it. So I've been playing fantasy football since before high school now. I mean, it's kind of crazy thinking about it, almost the last 2 decades, but the ability to talk about this now and actually like make content out of something that I love doing is just an awesome experience.
You would have never thought maybe in high school that this could be something that a true future could build from, and not, like you said, not going to work for the big guys, but just doing it on your own now in 2023 with the space where it is, with social media and content creators everywhere. Like, you can really, as long as you grind your butt off, like you clearly have been doing, you can make a name for yourself. So I think that's fantastic, man. Again, no hate here. I'm a Vikings fan, but let's be really honest here, Dave. There's really no reason for a Vikings fan to truly hate a Bears fan or even the Bears team. Like, I should hate on my own franchise for their lack of ineptitude and inability to get to the Super Bowl. And I can't put the blame on the other teams in my division or anything else. Right. So it is an unfortunate world that a Vikings fan currently lives in. But the name of this game is fantasy football. Dave, you are the expert. We are the novices, or so we like to say. But the topic that we want to discuss heading into fantasy football kicks off here in about 2-3 weeks. I think our draft is Labor Day weekend for our home league. But I want to talk to you, Dave, about really guys that we are viewing in ADP as being overvalued and undervalued. And I think with recent injuries, signings, things like that, that those rankings are shifting every single day. I mean, I put something on my list, and 20 minutes before we recorded, I got a notice saying this guy was hurt. So I was like, great, but we'll talk about it anyway. So it won't really matter. But that's how fast football is moving right now with getting close to the regular season. So to kick things off, Dave, let's start off with three of the most overvalued players, in my opinion, in fantasy football this year. I'll go one by one. I'll kick it to both of you guys so you guys can interject and give me your thoughts if I'm just completely off base here. But my number one player was going to be a player that I had to change because Chauvin ironically had the same guys as number one player. But Treylon Burks is my number one overvalued player in fantasy football this year. Looks like on ESPN, he is currently ranked as wide receiver 36. This was the guy that 20 minutes ago got carted off the field and suffered an LCL sprain. It looks like not going to be anything serious. They said he's going to miss a couple of weeks. But despite the injuries, guys, Treylon Burks, second-year receiver, hasn't really proved much, playing on a team that has an aging Ryan Tannehill, a team that is a run-first offense, a team that drafted a running back behind King Henry, a team that recently went out and signed DeAndre Hopkins to be their wide receiver one. I just don't think there's enough ball to go around for a run-first offense. And you look at guys who are being drafted right after Treylon Burks, all of these names I would personally take over him. Brandon Cooks, playing a wide receiver 2 in an offense that's going to throw the football a lot more with Dak Prescott, gladly would take that. Michael Thomas, maybe some would argue that they wouldn't take him, but he has a more proven track record than this guy does. He's playing with a better quarterback than Treylon Burks is. I would argue with Derek Carr, that's at least going to throw the football a little bit more. So I do like that as well. Cortland Sutton, I would like. Jahan Dotson, I think, is up and rising. Even guys like JSN and Jordan Addison, number 2 receivers on teams that are actually going to throw the football more and are a throwing offense versus Treylon Burks, who is not even going to get the football enough to justify being drafted where he is. Dave, I'll kick it off to you first. Thoughts on Treylon Burks?
I like Treylon Burks, the talent, but you did, talk about all the negatives here. That it's going to be a run-first team, and he's going to be the wide receiver 2 behind DeAndre Hopkins. So it's tough because, this ADP kind of flushes out early in the offseason, and drafters kind of become prisoners to ADP. You don't see a lot of people reaching too high or letting players slide too much. So you don't see guys dramatically shifting in ADP unless there is a brutal injury or something like that. So I think if we were looking at this from a completely clean slate at this point in the season, Treylon Burks would be getting drafted significantly lower than he is right now. But because ADP started working its way into drafts months ago, they didn't really correct the way that they should have when DeAndre Hopkins signed. So the talent is undeniable. And if something happens to DeAndre Hopkins, he's got the opportunity to step up there, but it's really tough to pull the trigger at him at his current cost.
Chauvin, you got any thoughts on that?
I just don't like the Titans receiving the way that they handle their, offense. I think that Derrick Henry and the running game is still going to be the main focus of that offense. So just going anyone, I mean, even DeAndre Hopkins, it kind of worries me. Tannehill to Hopkins connections, I'm not really bought in on that, especially since Hopkins last year in the last 6 weeks of the season didn't really connect with Kyler Murray either. So that just worries me. So I'm staying away from anything Titans receiver. Receiving core. I'm just staying away from that.
Yeah, I think, again, there's just opportunity for other young receivers in an offense that's more focused on passing that I would take at the current ADP that Treylon Burks is sitting at. Number 2 on my list, guys, Christian Watson, receiver for the Packers. ESPN has him currently as wide receiver 20. And I just quite frankly don't understand it. This is not a hate. I'm not hating on the Packers as a Vikings fan, but no Rodgers, right? Let's think about all of the factors. No Aaron Rodgers, who's potentially a Hall of Fame quarterback. To me personally, despite only having 4 drops, 6.1% drop rate, the hands are still a concern when you're expecting a fantasy football receiver to jump up in volume. He's going to get more passes his way, right? So I think with his hands still being a concern, no Aaron Rodgers. I still think the route running is potentially a concern. He hasn't flushed out the intermediate space. And we look at his production last year, over 3-4 weeks did he score all of his touchdowns? So it came in such a bunch with a Hall of Fame quarterback that now you're jumping into a unknown quarterback, a receiver that potentially, again, is a second-year receiver that needs maybe some a veteran presence on the team, right? And now you're going Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Randall Cobb is gone, and Jordan Love's the quarterback. Like, who's the guy on the team that's going to potentially keep these guys in line and really produce the way that offense can? So my fear is that if Rodgers was still there, I think there is another step for Watson to take. I just think that growth is going to be hindered when you're, putting it on the shoulders of arguably potentially a rookie quarterback. Chauvin, do you have thoughts on Christian Watson?
Man, Christian Watson, dude, it all depends on Jordan Love for me, right? Like Jordan Love at that one game last year looked really good, right? So is that the Jordan Love that we will see this season? Because if so, Christian Watson has the talent, like has the skills to be, be a receiver of like the number one receiver on that team. I understand they have Dobbs as well. So it's all going to count on him. I think that the uncertainty is the big question mark for me. But yeah, I mean, let's see what Jordan Love does in the next, like the preseason, weeks 2 and 3, like whatever's remaining of the games. But that's going to determine how I feel about Christian Watson. So a little unsure on him at this moment.
I mean, and you look at also real quick, the guys that are being drafted right around him, Calvin Ridley, Deontay Johnson, DJ Moore, and Terry McLaurin. All of which guys, again, we can dive into it, but all of which guys that I personally have ranked higher and would take over him. Dave, tell me I'm crazy.
I think you're a little bit crazy. I mean, Christian Watson is a really good football player, and he does lack some of the nuance and intricacies of the game that you want to see from a polished receiver. But I think the one thing that you didn't mention and that you're discounting is Matt LaFleur's play calling. He is a master at getting his guys open in space, and that's what we saw a lot of last year. He didn't need to be a polished route runner. They were running screens and slants and doing whatever they could to get him open in space. And once he has the ball in his hands, nobody on the defense is catching him. So if they're able to replicate some of the things that we saw last year, just hitting him when he's open across the middle, Jordan Love doesn't have to hit him back shoulder or deep downfield while he's covered. They're just going to get him on an island. And once the ball is in his hands, he can score from anywhere on the field. So he's going to have some down weeks for sure, but he's also going to have some game breaking weeks where he's going to score, 2 or 3 touchdowns, have 120 plus yards, and be a really, really nice fantasy performer.
Around where Christian Watson's getting drafted ADP wise, Dave, are there any other receivers that you would prefer over him, or the guys kind of that I had mentioned? Do you still lean Watson over some of those guys?
I like Deontay Johnson a lot, and you had mentioned him. ADP is a little bit different on every single website. Like I said, we're kind of prisoners to ADP at this point. So if you're drafting on Underdog, you're looking at one set of ADP, and if you're drafting on CBS or ESPN or Sleeper or wherever else, it's a little bit different. Out of the names that you listed, Deontay Johnson was one of the ones that jumped out to me big time. But when I'm looking at these high stakes leagues that I'm in, there's almost a 3-round gap between Christian Watson and Deontay Johnson. So you can draft Christian Watson and then wait a couple of rounds and still get Deontay Johnson on the same team. But when they're that close in ADP, as crazy as it sounds, because of the gap on other websites, I would actually prefer Deontay Johnson straight up to Christian Watson because of his ability to draw targets.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair, especially if we're talking PPR, half point PPR. That's the thing. Volume wise for Watson, it concerns me that just if you're in a standard league and you're touchdown dependent, maybe he ranks a little bit higher for you. But guys that are going to see the volume and the targets like Deontay, like potentially, in my opinion, Calvin Ridley and guys like that, I just think there's a little bit more of an upside. But number 3 on my list, real quick before we kick it over to you, Shovit, I have Miles Sanders, running back. He is ESPN ranked 19th running back right now. Similar feeling that I have with who the guy I initially wanted to talk about was, but I'm saving that again for Shovit. But it's just really regression on the offense. I mean, you look at a guy that played in Philadelphia who was one of the most explosive offenses that felt like at times there was just really nothing stopping them and they could beat you every which way, right? Jalen Hurts gets down the field and Jalen Hurts could quarterback sneak it in. They could run a fade route to AJ Brown. They could run a quick hitch to Devontae Smith, or Dallas Goedert's also there. But no, they still chose to give Miles Sanders 12 rushing touchdowns last year, despite all of those other offensive weapons that they have. Now, he goes from the Philadelphia Eagles now to a Carolina Panthers team that has a rookie quarterback, complete uncertainty at the receiving position, and their offensive line I'm not sold on. So, like, you look at the run blocking that the Eagles generated last year, and now you're going to a team that is inferior in every facet possible. Pair that with the fact that there are still other running backs on that roster. I'm not sold on Miles Sanders at RB19. Again, Dave, we're probably looking at different rankings because you look at ESPN, Sleeper, all the other websites, they're all kind of a little bit different. But on ESPN, he's ranked ahead of guys like James Conner. He's ranked ahead of guys like James Cook. He's ranked ahead of guys like Cam Akers. And personally, for me, I would take all of those guys ahead of him. Dave, what are your thoughts on Miles Sanders?
I think I would take Akers ahead of Sanders, but I'm okay taking Sanders ahead of those other two guys. Sanders is a good running back, and he's not a great running back, but he's pretty good. And Deuce Staley, the running back coach in Carolina, was very intentional in his willingness to go out and get him. He was the running back coach in Philadelphia when they drafted Miles Sanders and really helped coach him up to be the running back that he is today. So I don't know if Miles Sanders is going to have that, top 5 upside that you want to see from a running back, but he has very little competition in the backfield. He's going to see a huge workload. I'm not concerned at all about Chuba Hubbard or anybody else in that backfield. So I think that's really the selling point with Miles Sanders is he has a coach that believes in him, and he's probably going to see 70-80% of the opportunity share there in Carolina.
Yeah, I'll make my point really quick on Miles Sanders. I was big on him in the beginning of this offseason. Seeing that preseason game, seeing that offensive line worries me because you're right, he doesn't have competition. But is this team even going to be good enough for Miles Sanders to be productive? And I don't think that that would be the case. So that's why I've kind of retracted my position, and now I do feel like he is overvalued in this year's draft.
Yeah, that's fair. Again, those are my 3 guys. Shove it. Let me kick it off to you. Let's see what you got.
Yeah, so number one guy, the first guy I have is Joe Mixon. He is his current ADP and the ESPN Live Draft is 26, so that's RB10. Probably will go in the 3rd round. I just think that this is a guy that has terrible efficiency, like year in year out. Like he just is not an efficient running back. His big selling point last year was that 5-touchdown game, and outside of that, it's very average. Finished 49th in yards per attempt, 53 in yards per contact, 31st in missed tackles forced. Aging veteran, 28 years old. He's going to be like the Dalvin Cook of this year, next year, right? Like nobody wants him at this point. Like, maybe he gets picked up. And they have this rookie running back, Chase Brown, who it was a 5th rounder who could replace his job, Illinois running back. So I just think that his job, there's a big question mark about whether he'll be the starting running back for the Bengals by the end of the year. And I just think that he's just not as efficient to warrant RB10. I mean, that means top 10 running back this year. I don't think so. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I haven't done any drafts on ESPN so far this year, but that's crazy. I mean, most of the sites that I'm drafting at, he's going in like the 15 to 20 range. So I would never think about taking Joe Mixon that high. And it's the name value. He's a guy that everybody knows Joe Mixon's name, former 1st-round pick. He's been in the league for a long time. But you didn't even mention Travion Williams, another guy that they brought back on a 2nd contract and they like him a lot. So yeah, I'm not touching Joe Mixon at that price. That's gross.
Yeah, it is disgusting. And, people are probably like, oh, Samaje Perine's gone. And if you're not really in the weeds of football, the backups are names that maybe general fans haven't heard of, right? So they brought Mixon back. You look at his stats. You look at the fact that the backup that was doing all the 3rd down work is now gone. So naturally, the general fan in you wants to be like, oh, this means that Mixon is probably going to do well. But like you said, Shova, you hit on all the points. He's aging. There wasn't even like a surefire, I guess they weren't for sure that they were bringing him back, right? So there was uncertainty in the offseason around whether they even wanted him back. So that already tells me that they're kicking the can. They're looking at what they have in the backup in the 2nd and the 3rd string. And I think that just means less work for Mixon.
Well, they also forced him to take a pay cut, if you remember. They made him restructure his deal. They said, hey, you see what's happening with Ezekiel Elliott and Dalvin Cook and Leonard Fournette and Kareem Hunt? You don't want that to be you. So how about you just come back for half the price that we were going to pay you and don't test that free agency market?
Yeah, that does not instill confidence on me as a fantasy owner to try to draft him. He's taking a pay cut. All right, so number 2, I have the 49ers defense. And you guys are like, why are you putting defense on there? Because they're the first defense to go in ESPN mock draft. The number 1 defense there. ADP is 73. And here's my thing with 49ers defense. They lose D'Amico Ryan, their defensive coordinator. They lose Mosley. They lose Alshire. They did get Javon Hargrove, but I just don't think that, like, there's so many uncertainties with the 49ers defense that do you really think you can start them every single week to draft them at the ADP of 73? I think that's kind of ridiculous. Like, I would rather get, I don't know, the Saints defense, or maybe later on you skip out and you get the Patriots defense if that's possible. But the 49ers defense, there's just, I'm not convinced that that is going to be the number 1 defense given all the people they lost, the personnel that they lost on defense. Suika, what do you think?
Yeah, Dave's probably laughing because he's like, you guys still playing leagues where you have to draft a defense? What is this nonsense? But no, I mean, I'm with you. Defense is tough. I mean, you can draft a defense. A lot of times people will draft the best defense by far and they'll reach on them just because they're like, yes, I locked in the best defense, so I don't have to worry about maybe changing my defense on a week-to-week basis. But it doesn't matter if you have the best defense in football. You're still going to have to change your defense on a week-to-week basis, possibly based on matchups, injuries, like forecast, like where you're playing, all that stuff, right? So it's not like you're drafting Patrick Mahomes as the number 1 quarterback and you're just going to set it and forget it. Despite getting the 49ers, despite getting the Patriots, despite getting one of Dallas or somebody like that, you're still on a week-to-week basis. So for me, drafting a defense and where you draft them, if you're drafting a defense earlier than the 14th or 15th round, you're really just banking on the fact that you've looked at maybe their first 3 weeks worth of schedules, and they are in such a favorable spot that you're like, for 3 weeks, I'm not going to have to worry about a defense, and they have the upside potentially that because they're playing really bad teams. That would be the only instance. But I agree with you. 73rd ADP for a defense, that is asinine.
I mean, Nick Bosa's holding out too, which wasn't even mentioned. I mean, we don't even know if he's playing this year because they don't have the salary cap to pay Nick Bosa. So there's a very good opportunity that a very good chance that Nick Bosa is playing somewhere else week one. Yeah, I mean, just paying up for a defense is silly because the reality is you're gonna end up dropping them during your bye week anyway. So yeah, I am always team stream defense, stream kicker. If I'm drafting more than a couple weeks out from week one, I'm not even drafting a defense or a kicker. I'm using those late picks on injury away running backs, hoping that I can get somebody that is going to stumble into opportunity from a training camp injury. I'm not even looking at defenses at this point in the offseason.
Oh, that's a great strategy. Yeah, I like that. All right, so last up on my list of overvalued, I have Jahmyr Gibbs. So the reason I have Jahmyr Gibbs, modeling last year, Jamal Williams finished RB8, Swift finished RB2, and Swift was riddled with
22. Was it 2 or 222?
RB22.
Yeah.
And he was, riddled with injuries. I think that you see a regression of, the crazy touchdowns that Jamal Williams had. And I think that David Montgomery will replace what Jamal Williams was. So for that reason, I just don't think that Gibbs will be a 3-down back. They signed David Montgomery this year, a 3-year, $18 million contract. So they're going to utilize him. And I think that you can get a David Montgomery, you can get similar player in Gibbs in terms of utilization in David Montgomery in the later rounds. So to me, Gibbs is just way too high. Both of these guys may finish in the top 20, but where he's going at right now, ADP, I think is at 42. That just seems way too high for Jahmyr Gibbs with a lot of uncertainties around him.
Dave, take the wheel.
Jahmyr Gibbs is one of my favorite draft picks this year. I've been saying that if his ADP creeps up into the top 15, I'm still okay drafting Jahmyr Gibbs. I love this guy, man. And if you look, running backs that were drafted in the top 12 over the past decade, Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, and then this year it's Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson. The worst fantasy output that we saw from one of those guys in their rookie season was running back 10. And then we saw Todd Gurley and Ezekiel Elliott both finish inside the top 2. So that's kind of the range of outcomes that I'm looking at for Jahmyr Gibbs, is that his floor is top 10 and he has the ceiling to be number 1 overall. His pass catching upside and what he can do in the open field makes him such a just weapon that can be deployed all over the place. I'm a big fan of Jahmyr Gibbs, and I understand a lot of people get scared off by rookie running backs, but I think that we're going to see a game-breaking season coming from Jahmyr Gibbs this year.
You don't think there's any slight to his value based on the fact that they did pay Montgomery and he got the biggest running back contract maybe before Dalvin Cook got his $8.6 million? Like, considering the fact that the way they used their running backs last year, Dave, and knowing that Jahmyr Gibbs is a rookie, I mean, the perception was that he was drafted a little high, at least for me personally. Maybe you thought, the Lions didn't reach on him, but if you're taking a running back there, you're right. The idea is you would obviously play them, but then on the flip side, they went and paid a running back in free agency who, again, is no slouch. Like, David Montgomery for a while has been a staple for the Bears. He's just there. He just continues to take carries away from the upside possibility of a guy like Khalil Herbert. So it's super annoying, but that's kind of what I fear. He's going to come and be this like stability for the Lions. And the only caveat to that is this whole Jameson Williams debacle. If they do end up featuring Gibbs and they're like, you know what, we got 2 guys, they're playmakers, let's get them both on the field. And they put Gibbs in more of a weapon type, right? Like, you're just on the field and we need to put the ball in your hands. Then I think, you could maybe justify the upside and he could be a potential league winner. But where he's getting drafted is equivalent to being like the guy on your team as maybe potentially RB1 or 2. And with another running back in the backfield, I just have my reservation, especially one that they paid this offseason.
So even in standard scoring, obviously in PPR, it changes the calculus a little bit, but even in standard scoring, a target is worth 2.5 times as much as a carry. And Jahmyr Gibbs is a pass catching machine. So if he can get into that like 80, 100 target range, he could have a season similar to what we saw from Najee Harris as a rookie. And Najee Harris, even Christian McCaffrey wasn't all that involved as a rusher his rookie season, but the targets made up for it and allowed him to finish inside the top 10. So that's really the allure with Jahmyr Gibbs. You're not expecting him to be the guy. He's not going to see 300 plus touches, but he's going to get those high value touches. He's going to get pass catching opportunities in the open field. And despite his small size, he is a powerful runner that can also see some goal line work as well. And the last thing I'll say is the Detroit Lions offense is going to be bonkers this year. I mean, they were one of the best offenses last year. Their defense is terrible. They're playing 12 of their 17 games indoors this year. They're going to be in barn burners almost every single week, and it's going to be highly consolidated to Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, and then possibly Sam Laporta, but there aren't a ton of weapons there, and Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be one of those main weapons.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Process of elimination of guys not being there with the Jameson Williams stuff. Like, I think if he's going to see the field, you're right. The upside's there. We just personally have some reservations. But Davis, take us home with your overvalued players.
I hate to start off with this one because I see you wearing that Viking shirt, but man, I think that Alexander Mattison is so overvalued right now. Where I'm doing most of my drafting right now on Underdog Fantasy, he's getting drafted as RB19 RB18. And I understand the argument for Alexander Mattison. We've been waiting for all of these years for him to finally take that opportunity from Dalvin Cook. And when he has been the starter in lieu of Dalvin Cook, he has performed pretty well most of those games, but there's so much context missing from those games. First of all, in 4 of the 6 starts that he's had throughout his career, they've come against the league's worst rush defenses. And in those games, he averaged 103 rushing yards, 46 receiving yards, and 26.1 fantasy points per game. The 2 times that he had to face off against a top 10 run defense, he averaged less than 10 fantasy points per game on just 33 rushing yards. And granted, this was years and years and years ago. Over the last few years, we've seen his efficiency dwindle. Every single efficiency metric that I care about: yards per attempt, yards per target, yards per touch, yards after contact per attempt, breakaway run rate, broken tackle rate, yards per route run, rushing yards over expectation. He set career lows in last year. We heard that the team wanted to bring back Dalvin Cook. They've courted Kareem Hunt. They brought in Mike Davis for a workout a couple of days ago. I don't think that they're sold on Alexander Mattison being the guy, even if they don't sign a veteran. I think that Ty Chandler, Dwayne McBride, Kenny Nwangu, I think they're all very good running backs, and I don't see Alexander Mattison having a stranglehold on the backfield the way that Dalvin Cook has in years past.
I totally agree with you there. I've never thought that Alexander Mattison jumped off the screen where, you saw Dalvin Cook and he was a game changer, right? I mean, he just had the X factor. Mattison doesn't have that. And Dave, you're hitting a great point, is a lot of these people just fall into when Dalvin was out, Alexander filled his shoes and he was perfect, right? So if he's just plug and play in this offense, then he should be great. Couple things you mentioned, that was years back. We're in a completely different offensive system now too. It was Mike Zimmer when he wanted to run the ball down your throat, and now you have Kevin O'Connell who's trying to open up the passing game. So the reason they're bringing in these running backs is, like you said, they're not sold on Mattison, and the biggest thing is third down running back. They don't want Mattison to be the third down guy. They love Ty Chandler, but here's the problem with Ty Chandler, who can pass catch as a third down back. He can't pass protect. So they're trying to find a guy that's going to be the the balance between the two. And like you said, if they were sold on Mattison, there's no reason this late into training camp they're bringing in these random veterans. Kareem Hunt, I can understand, but when you're bringing in Mike Davis for a workout, there's definitely something that you're not completely sold on in your backfield.
Yeah, I just think that there's so much context missing from this. Like you said, I mean, those spot starts were beautiful, and it's really easy to just say, this guy's going to get 20 points in a 1-week spot start, but it's really hard to project that volume over a full 17-game season. You hear the term replacement level players all the time. I think that's what Alexander Mattison is. I don't think that he's any better than like a league average running back. So all it takes is for Ty Chandler to have one good game, and then they start going with a hot hand approach. So if I draft Alexander Mattison, if he falls to me in a draft for whatever reason, if he starts out the year hot, I'm immediately trying to trade him away.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy.
Absolutely. But there's a lot of guys that are right around that area that you might want to consider, right? Like James Cook, I think, is going to be a better guy for you to get, or Connor instead of Madison, given all that we've talked about. So yeah, definitely going to shy away from Madison for sure.
The next guy I'll talk about, and this is a very topical one, Ramondre Stevenson. Right now where he's getting drafted on where I'm typically drafting is late second, early third round. And that might dip a little bit. If he dips into like the fourth round, then I might be in at the cost. But it's kind of a lazy take, but I just don't want to draft a Patriots running back this early. The thing that Ramondre Stevenson has working against him is how good of a running back he is. And I know that sounds crazy, so just bear with me a second here, but he can do it all. He can be the pass catching back, he can be the goal line back, he could be that early down bruiser. And we know Bill Belichick is never going to make a running back the workhorse. The only reason we saw that role for Ramondre Stevenson last year is because they had two rookies on the team and an injured Damian Harris. So Ramondre Stevenson was shoehorned into this workhorse role. But now we're drafting him with the assumption that he is going to see 80 plus targets and he's going to be the passing down specialist. But with Ezekiel Elliott there now, there is a world where Ezekiel Elliott gets all of the goal line work. They split up the passing down work between Ty Montgomery and Pierre Strong, and all that leaves for Ramondre Stevenson is that between the 20s early down work. So he might be the lead back in theory where he's getting 200 carries per season, but if he's not catching passes and if he's not getting goal line work, those are low calorie touches that don't really bode well for fantasy success. So right now you're investing a late second or an early third round pick in Ramondre Stevenson, and his floor is terrible. There's a realistic world where he is the new Damian Harris, where if he's not scoring a touchdown, he's only giving you 3 or 4 points a week.
He's just one of those guys that like will keep dropping on like every single round, and you're like, should I get him? Should I pick him up? And you can't fall for that trap. And every year there's some guy that does that, right? There's a player just up there, and I feel like Stevenson's gonna be one of those guys that just that second round ADP seems ridiculous for him.
I mean, I had a huge 180 swing with Stevenson. I don't know if this changed for you prior to Zeke Elliott or if you felt this way throughout the entire offseason, Dave, but I was higher on Stevenson before the Zeke signing because, like you said, the backups are just nobodies. Like, I mean, yes, Bill Belichick is the ideal guy that's going to get a nobody in there and he's going to, catch passes on third down, get 500 yards, and somehow just go out and get a contract somewhere else and do absolutely nothing. But with that being said, I felt like before Zeke, this was the first year where the backups were literally nobodies. Like it wasn't the Sony Michels, it wasn't the James Whites, it wasn't the Damian Harrises. So I was really high on Ramondre because it was either Ramondre is the guy this year or this is it for Ramondre, personally, in my opinion, in the NFL as a whole, being the guy. And now with you getting Zeke, you've already laid it all out. But the other aspect of areas where he could lose work is even on situations where you have a back blocking and then leaking out. Zeke is one of the best pass protecting running backs in the NFL. So if somehow the offensive line doesn't play up to par and they need to start putting running backs back there to protect, I think it's going to be more Zeke than Ramondre. And so you're just slowly dwindling away touches and time for Ramondre to be on the field. And I think, like you said, where you're drafting him, you're ideally drafting him to be almost your RB1 if you go receivers early, and it's just not a good spot to be in.
And then the last guy I'll talk about is Deebo Samuel. And this one pains me because like watching Deebo Samuel play, he's one of my favorite football players in the league. And I actually like my claim to fame kind of in the fantasy industry was being Deebo Samuel's biggest fan back in 2021 when everybody was fading him. The team had just drafted Brandon Ayuk. Everyone said Brandon Ayuk was going to put Deebo Samuel out of a job. I had Deebo Samuel on every single one of my fantasy teams. I was hyping this guy up all offseason. And then he finished as the overall wide receiver 2 behind only Cooper Kupp. I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. But if you look at the way that season shook out, Brandon Ayuk was like in the doghouse for the first half of the season. Kyle Shanahan just hated him for some reason. So he was able to be like this, 10 target a game alpha that we saw for half a year. And then in that same year, they traded up for Trey Sermon, who ended up being a huge bust. And then Elijah Mitchell got hurt. And then they turned Deebo Samuel into a goal line back where he's scoring a rushing touchdown almost every single week. And that year, he finishes the overall wide receiver 2. But if we look at every other season Deebo Samuel's been in the league, he has been a boomer bust wide receiver 3. So 4 years into the league, we're looking at wide receiver 3, one season where he was an elite wide receiver 1. And then last year, he went back to being a boomer bust wide receiver 3. So it's really easy to chalk up that one season as just kind of the outlier. And people are still chasing that, trying to recapture that lightning in a bottle from that magical season 2 years ago. And the reality is that Deebo Samuel role that we have been chasing is now the Christian McCaffrey role. He's getting all of those short targets in the flat. He's getting the goal line work. And you can see it last year that Deebo Samuel was looking pretty good to start the year. And then as soon as Christian McCaffrey showed up, all of those high value touches just disappeared.
I'm in the same camp. I'm in the same camp with you. I was a Debo Samuel owner last year, so maybe it's still kind of that fog in my brain telling me that I don't need to draft him again this year. But you're right. It's just too many mouths to feed. It's a system that's so based on like pre-snap reads. Like you already kind of know what you're doing with the football before you snap the ball, right? So if you're just in a game plan where, hey, this is the week where Debo Samuel is just not going to do anything, because they have weeks like that. George Kittle just goes missing one week, like Brandon Ayuk pops in and then doesn't pop. Same thing with Debo Samuel. It's just, who are you going to take on that offense outside of CMC that you're going to be like, I wouldn't be surprised if this guy gives me like 2 or 3 points this week. And it's like Kittle, Ayuk, Debo, they all have that bust upside. CMC, I would say, is the only one in that offense, obviously, that's foolproof. But I am in lockstep with you on Debo Samuel. He's a guy that I consistently see myself just ignoring, and then everybody else continues to ignore. And then there were like 2 drafts in a row where I just took him because I was like, it's like 3 rounds later. I might as well just take him at this point. But Shoba, do you have any thoughts on Debo?
All valid points. I mean, nothing more to add. You guys hit it all.
Yeah, it's a lightning in a bottle. He's playing such a unique unicorn type role. I remember the year he popped off. I'm pretty sure he had like double-digit touchdowns and 7 or 8 rushing touchdowns. So it's just hard to replicate such a touchdown dependent successful season. So I'm with you there. I know we are running long, Dave. You are absolutely correct that it is almost impossible to get all of these players talked about in a 30-minute timeline. With 30 minutes already passed, we still have players that we want to talk about that are undervalued. I don't want to keep you long. We can certainly do that another time. We can chalk this up. I did also have rapid fire I wanted to throw at you, just kind of get you on your toes. Do you have thoughts? I want to be cognizant.
Let's jump into the rapid fire. Let's go ahead and do it.
Perfect. I love it. Love it. Love it. Okay. Rapid fire. Some of these you've already kind of mentioned. So if I feel like I'm repeating myself, I apologize. Favorite football team, Dave?
Chicago Bears. That one, like I said, born and raised in Chicago, I never really had a choice.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I was born in Nebraska. That's how I became a Vikings fan. Similar story. Super cold. Can't go outside in the winters. What are you going to do? You're going to sit on your couch and watch football. So makes sense there. Favorite football player?
Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler, I actually liked him way before he came to Chicago. I was ecstatic when the Bears finally traded for him. And I can go on and on and on about how the Bears just completely destroyed his development. He was still a pretty raw guy coming in. He was coming off a 4,000-yard season with about a dozen sacks. Then he shows up in Chicago behind a terrible offensive line with no pass catching weapons, takes 50 sacks in his first year, and just kind of unraveled from there. I think that Jay Cutler could have been an all-time great if he was put into a better system at that age.
It felt like they just brought him on to be the savior, but they put no infrastructure around him. Similar to kind of like, I think he's got more, I don't know, he's shown more flashes than so far, in my opinion, what Justin Fields has shown, but similar trajectory where they're like, hey, come be the savior, but we're just going to put nobody around you. Really weird. Yep. Eye test or analytics?
I'm an analytics guy. Like I said, I love numbers, but really, what I try to do is my process starts with my eyes, and then I try to find the analytics that can back up my takes. And a lot of times my eyes will tell me something, and then the numbers don't back me up. And I say, all right, well, I'm just going to scrap that take. But when my eyes tell me something and then the numbers back it up, that's when I run with it.
Do you ever have a take where the numbers don't run with it, but you're just so on it that you're like, you know what, this is something that I'm going to, follow to my grave?
Yeah, a few years ago, Debo Samuel, before I really honed in my analytics process, and I got super lucky and bailed out by a wildly efficient season that will never happen again. So, I can pat myself on the back for it, but at the end of the day, it was a terrible process, and I just kind of lucked into the right result.
Sometimes it pays to be lucky. Defenses and kickers or not?
No, I'm not a big fan.
I guess this is rapid fire, but you are a proponent of Sleeper. You're a proponent of all these other apps that are utilizing, more skilled players. Tell me a little bit about this shift, Dave, how it's taken place and why you would advocate for that versus the traditional way.
Just playing on Sleeper, the app you're saying?
Or in general, like all these leagues are shifting more to having like multiple flex. You don't have a kicker, you don't have a defense, and everybody seems to be annoyed with the idea that defenses and kickers still exist in leagues. So I guess talk to me about that side.
Well, they're just impossible to project. I mean, it's really just like a wild card that you're throwing in your lineup. Not that every position doesn't have some sort of randomness to it, but when you start adding flex spots, then you start rewarding the managers that are a little bit better at projecting the game and picking up those good players. At the end of the day, you can have a kicker that, it just increases the randomness. It's such a hard position to project. Even the people who are kicker analysts will tell you that it is such a hard and random random position. And then the same thing with defenses. There's so many external factors that can affect that. I'm totally okay playing with IDP. I think that that's a fun wrinkle to the game, but I like sticking to, just as many flex spots as possible. And we actually just made that switch in my home league where we got rid of kickers and defenses, but we added 2 more flex spots.
I would love to meet someone that says fantasy football kicker analyst on their LinkedIn profile. Like, what kind of research are they doing? I want to meet that guy.
Everything is random, so it doesn't even matter what research you do, right? At the end of the day, it's not going to necessarily matter. Bigger impact to the starting running back, Dave. Stevenson with the Zeke signing or Breece Hall with the Dalvin Cook signing?
I think Dalvin Cook impacts Breece Hall a lot more, and not so much that he impacts him, but it's what that tells us. We were hopeful. They said it was a clean tear and that he was going to be on track for week 1 and all that. But for them to go out and give that much money to Dalvin Cook, it tells us that Breece Hall probably isn't healing up the way that we had hoped. So I don't know if it's that Dalvin Cook necessarily negatively impacts him, but it tells us a lot about what's happening with Breece Hall's knee.
Yeah, no, that's a fair assumption. Favorite fantasy football platform?
Sleeper, hands down. I have actually gotten off every other format that I'm playing this year. Got off ESPN, got off Yahoo. The one other format I'll play on is Underdog Fantasy, but that is best ball only. So you don't have to worry about going in and setting waivers and making trades and setting lineups and all that stuff. You just draft it and forget it. But when it comes to in-season league management, Sleeper is the only way I'll play. And I got a plug. You can actually find my app in there. I just closed a partnership with Sleeper. So if you download the Sleeper app, you can go to their podcast tab and you will see the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show and check out all of our episodes right there.
Oh, you made us a believer. We're switching our league this year. So that's
actually,
done
as
deal.
of today, it just surpassed ESPN in the App Store for the #1 fantasy sports app.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Huge. Congratulations, man. That's
yeah,
awesome.
we need to do some research on that. Maybe we're just behind the 8 ball there. Biggest bust potential in 2023, Dave. Give me a name.
Ooh, that's a good one. Put me on the spot here. Alexander Madison is the guy that I have been singing about all year as being a huge potential bust. I already talked about him a ton, though. I don't know. I feel like I already talked about the 3 busts that I've been kind of singing about all off season, but I'd go with Alexander Madison. I wrote an article on him a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you guys are hip hop fans or not, but I'd say it's up there with like Ice Cube's "No Vaseline" is one of the best diss tracks of all time that I wrote about Alexander Madison.
Oh man, that's fantastic. Where can we find your articles? Is it on the website?
Footballguys.com.
Okay, perfect. Last question. Who is the player that is going to be the biggest fantasy football winner in 2023?
Marquise Brown. And I know this is scaring off a lot of people, but Marquise Brown is so suppressed in value right now because of the uncertainty with Kyler Murray's ACL. And I get it. But when I'm drafting Kyler Murray, I don't care if he gives me zeros for the first 8 weeks of the year. I am drafting Marquise Brown to be that late season hammer that's going to help me win fantasy football championships. And we saw this for years while he was in Baltimore. If you look at like all the super nerdy data, his route run metrics and things like that, he was popping off the charts, but it was such a bad offense led by Greg Roman, and he just wasn't getting utilized properly. Then we see it in a very small taste at the beginning of the 2022 season in Arizona, where there was no DeAndre Hopkins, who was suspended for PEDs. He was the wide receiver 1 on that team. And over that 5-game stretch with Kyler Murray, he averaged 10.8 targets per game. He was the wide receiver 5 in PPR scoring behind just Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, and Devontae Adams. He was on pace for 1,400 yards and 8 touchdowns.
Wow.
He and Kyler Murray have that connection that goes back to college. Now, we know that Kyler Murray, when he comes back from the ACL, probably won't be the player that he was prior to the ACL, but that's going to impact his scrambling. It's not going to impact his ability to pass the ball. So when I'm drafting Marquise Brown, like I said, he could do nothing to start the season with Clayton Tune or Colt McCoy or whoever it is under center. I am strictly drafting him to help me bring home a championship at the end of the year.
I love that. I think that's a great strategy. Far too often people won't have a long-term plan like that with a player. They'll be like, oh, he's not going to be doing well the first couple of weeks, so why would I draft him? But no, I think that makes a ton of sense. That opens my eyes a little bit. Looks like I need to do some Hollywood Brown research to see what all the hype is about. Dave, that is all we have for you, man. Thank you so much for your time. I know we took a little bit more of it than I intended to, but again, one last time, where can everybody find you?
Just follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. Hopefully you're fluent in sarcasm and memes, because that's a lot of that there. But you can also find all my content. So when I guest on podcasts or shows or anything like that, I'll share it from my page. You can find my show as well. You can find all my written articles. And then I do try to share a lot of the stats and data and nuggets that I'm pulling up during my research. So at Dave Kluge on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it.
Perfect. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we can get you back on sometime this season, kind of see what is going on with the fantasy world. Again, I'm Sweetcart. That is Shovit. That is our guest, Dave Kluge. We are the Only Playbook Guys. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Have a great week. Bye-bye.